Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Philly Factor. I'm your host, Paul Perrello. In December 1966, the world was shocked to learn of the passing of Walt Disney. Uh, this was a time where there was so much going on in the world, and Walt came into our living rooms every Sunday evening with his television show, and we were all familiar with that television show, and we were also familiar with all of his movies that graced our movie theaters. And then, of course, when the word came out that he had passed away, it was like we lost a member of our own family. Much has been written about Walt, about the beginning of the Walt Disney Company. Much has been written about the Michael Eisner era of the Walt Disney Company, as well as where the company is today. But what has not been written about much is the period of time between 1966 and the Michael Eisner era in 1984. That is until now. My guest on this edition of the program, Neil O'Brien, has sought to make that his mission to get word out about what the Walt Disney Company went through after Walt Disney died. And hence, that's the name of his book, After Disney. It is the story of the toil, trouble, and the transformation of America's favorite media company. It's written by Neil O'Brien. Neil, thanks so much for spending some time with us here on the Philly Factor.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
I think you would agree, only because you have labored with this project for more than a decade now, almost 2 decades.
Yeah.
I think you would agree that not much has been written about the Walt Disney Company after the passing of Walt in 1966 and the time that Michael Eisner takes over the company in 1984.
Yeah. I mean, portions of the story, especially around maybe the opening of Disney World, Walt Disney World in Florida, have been, studied, but a lot of histories about the company end with Walt in 1966, and they jump almost 20 years ahead to when Michael Eisner came in. And yet there is a through line at the company from Walt's time to Michael Eisner's time that is really important to where the company wound up. It's the success it had, and really the whole entertainment industry has had as a result of things that were going on in Disney at that time. The animation department almost shut down right after Walt's death. Now animation is a billion-dollar industry. 9 out of the top 10 movies streamed last year were animated, and major companies, including Disney's rivals, DreamWorks, Pixar, which is part of Disney, they have their roots in this time period. So there's so much happening. The company expands the definition of what a Disney film can be at the time with Touchstone Pictures, which we could talk about. That we now have a company that has a much broader umbrella under which can fit a Nat Geo and ESPN, a Marvel and a Star Wars. So much was happening during this 20-year period that impacts today that it just felt like it needed to be explored in a serious manner, and in depth, because it gets overlooked, but it is very vital.
Sure. There was no succession plan, at least from what I can tell, when, for Walt. I mean, I guess everybody thought that Walt would live forever. And of course, there's many jokes that are out there that Walt is still with us in some way, shape, or form. But there really wasn't a succession plan when the time would come that Walt would pass away. It was assumed, and his brother Roy O. Disney actually took over and made sure that Walt Disney World would open in 1971. But beyond that, there was really no plan in place for this, for the continuance of the Walt Disney Company.
Yeah, Walt Disney, he had terminal lung cancer that was discovered only a few weeks before his death. And so even a few days before his death, his brother Roy hoped that he could get through it. And the severity of the cancer, I think, took a lot of people by surprise. And the title of the book, After Disney, is actually a quote that came from Walt earlier in 1966, before he was diagnosed with cancer, where he talks about, as well as he can, he's untying the apron strings of the company. But there's not a lot of evidence that there was any kind of clear succession plan. Upon news of his demise, they had to stop trading of the Disney stock for a short time because investors were just really uncertain about what the company's future looked like. Roy O. Disney, Walt's brother, had to reassure them that things would continue in the manner that Walt had sort of laid out. And they did that for a long time, sort of followed a lot of the paths that Walt had put forth. I think it's worth noting, he was 65 when he died. He was on the precipice of a lot of new big projects. Walt Disney World in Florida, Epcot, which was going to be a utopian community, the creation of Cal Arts, which was going to be this uh, school where transdiscipline learning of the arts would take place. So there were all these big ticket agenda items for Walt that it surprised a lot of people when he died that he was near the end.
Mm.
So yeah, it took the company by surprise. It took investors by surprise, his demise. And so the company was thrown into a bit of uncertainty.
Yeah. And a Ron Miller, who was Walt's son-in-law, who perhaps does not get enough credit for trying to helm the company from Walt's death until he's ousted in the 1980s. But Ron sort of not only stayed the course, but also brought many things to the table, including a new movie studio, which would sort of break out of the mold of Walt Disney Pictures and the Walt Disney Company. Things like Splash, other movies that would follow that wouldn't necessarily you would think of as Walt Disney Pictures or movies, but I guess, Ron realized that something needed to be done to grow the company and move it in a way that it was going to continue to be a viable entertainment industry for the decades to come.
Yeah, Ron Miller, when I started this project, I was fortunate enough to speak to him, but it wasn't even until later in my journey that I really decided to focus on his contributions to the company, into the degree that I do, because he's a really important figure. He became CEO of the company. This was a guy who met Walt's daughter in college. He was a football player. They met at a football game in Northern California, even though they attended USC in Southern California. Um, and it was kind of a whirlwind romance, but Walt and his wife Lillian just really took to Ron. Um, Diane Disney, his wife, would say that he was a bit of a blank notebook, right? He's a college kid. And after playing in the NFL and some time in the Army, Walt takes him in at the studio and really mentors him because he is a young kid who Walt sees a lot of promise in. So, to your point about where Ron took the company and the brand, part of the thing that one moment that stayed with Ron from his time with Walt was a screening at the Walt's private screening room of the Universal film To Kill a Mockingbird. And Ron thinks it's about as perfect a film as you can make. And when the lights come on, Walt is visibly frustrated. And he says, I wish I could make that movie, but I can't because the public would not accept that from me. Keep in mind, it's 1962. The country is violently divided over civil rights. And Walt's brand of filmmaking is non-controversial family films. And so he feels like he could not make a movie like To Kill a Mockingbird, even though if you step back for a moment and you think of the heroine Scout, young child protagonist is not dissimilar from a lot of what Disney was turning out for live action during this time period. So this frustration that Walt had with his brand stayed with Ron. So right after Walt's demise, Hollywood undergoes a major revolution with what some critics call the American Renaissance of films, movies like The Godfather, like Easy Rider and The Graduate, movies that are pushing the envelope with mature storytelling, pushing the envelope in terms of content, whether it's violence or obscenities or innuendo. Hollywood's undergoing that big shift, but Disney's kind of keeps its head in the sand and keeps turning out product for families and they're largely successful for a good chunk of the 70s. But when Hollywood shifts again in the late 70s with Spielberg, with Star Wars, and this new Hollywood comes in where family films now can be PG rated, whether it's a Superman or a Bad News Bears. All of a sudden, Disney uh, find, and specifically Ron Miller, find themselves at this point where they need to win back the audience. And so the movie-going audience at that point is a lot of teenagers, it's a lot of young adults, and Ron, for a number of years and a number of attempts, tries to win back this audience that they seem to have lost. And eventually he hits on the fact that they need to create something that doesn't necessarily have the Disney label, but is obviously a Disney film because it's made by Disney, and that is Touchstone Pictures. The first film is Splash, big hit, introduced us to Tom Hanks, introduced us to many people, to a young director, Ron Howard,
Hmm.
former child actor. And it's a big hit. It's kind of like big smash that Disney hasn't had in a long time. The second film to come out of Touchstone that's not as well known these days is this movie Country by Jessica Lange, all about the Iowa farm crisis that was happening in real time. In many ways, that is the social issues picture that Walt felt he couldn't do 20 years earlier.
Sure.
And, you know, pretty well received critically at the time. It eventually finds an audience on home video in the mid 80s, and does have some impact on that actual crisis by raising awareness at a time when, getting the story out from something happening in the middle of the country was harder, because the media centers were New York and LA primarily at that point. So yeah, that's a lot of Ron Miller's sort of film journey, but a lot of that really comes from the fact that he was so tied into Walt and he remembered that moment of To Kill a Mockingbird, that in many ways he was empowered to create something as radically different as Touchstone, because he knew that the man who had started this company, the man who was his mentor, felt that in many ways Walt had created his own sort of creative straitjacket. As successful and as wonderful as that was, it had limitations. And so anyway, so I think that Ron Miller had a big role in reimagining what can be housed within the Walt Disney Company.
And they continue to make animated movies during this time, one of which has ties to the Philadelphia area, and that is The Black Cauldron, based on a series of books by Lloyd Alexander, who was born in Philadelphia and passed away in Drexel Hill. And it's one of those movies that doesn't necessarily get all the attention that movies like that would come later, like The Little Mermaid. It did not get the attention of movies like Cinderella, Pinocchio, even up until the last movie that Walt saw before he died, The Jungle Book. But it's a movie that nonetheless Ron Miller championed, and as I said, has connections to the Philadelphia area.
Yeah. So it even goes back just a few months, a year and a half or so after Walt's death, that the Lloyd Alexander books come to the attention of Disney, and they start exploring it as a potential property for animation. The books were very successful at the time. I wasn't alive, so I can't quite know if it was at a Harry Potter level per se, but
Right.
very successful group of children's books. They were winning awards in real time during that era. And within that, Disney, especially a story man, Otto Englander, who had worked on the early Disney films Snow White and others, saw a lot of potential in the Lloyd Alexander books to create something like a Snow White or Pinocchio, something that could stand the test of time, that had life and death stakes. Um, and so he starts exploring that originally in 1968. It takes a company a few more years before they go ahead and acquire the books. And then they actually bring Lloyd Alexander over to LA in the early 70s to join Disney's animation story team to try to help develop the Prydain books into what would become the Black Cauldron.
Mm.
Lloyd Alexander, really interesting character. Hopefully, people know him. If you don't, I talk about him in my book, but he's definitely a figure that hopefully a lot of people know in the Philadelphia area. I know I read his books growing up, not too far from where you are.
Yeah.
Um, and, he uh, grew up in Philly during World War II. He was deployed overseas. As part of his deployment, he spent some time in Wales. And within Wales, this guy who had spent most of his childhood reading the literature of King Arthur and other mythology really connects with the land, and it stays in his imagination for years to come. And eventually, when he decides he's going to be serious about becoming an author, and after his first attempts at writing books for adults don't quite take off the way he hoped, he has a lot of success with the Prydain books. So Disney brings him over, and it ends up being a little bit of a bad fit for him. The Disney story team at that point is established veterans who had worked together for decades, and he has a little bit of a hard time breaking into the writers' room. But he does lay out a lot of the background for the animators and story artists, and helps them as they sort of coalesce around some of the key themes and key characters that will be eventually in the movie. And so he spends a good chunk, a couple of years working both in Hollywood and then in Philadelphia on the books, sorry, on the movies. And then decides that he's going to step away from active development because he wants to go back to being a writer. But anyway, his story is definitely an interesting one, and he is a really great Philadelphia success story.
Sure. What is the relationship between the um, Walt Disney side of the family and the Roy O. Disney side of the family? Because on the cover of your book, I had when I first got the book and I looked at it, I said, "Oh, this has got to be like a Photoshop picture of the two of them walking," because neither one of them, Roy E. Disney and Ron Miller, neither one of them look really all that happy. And I'm like, well, that had to be two pictures that you merged together, but it's not. That they're both in the same picture walking
Yeah,
here, and so I don't know where that picture came from, but it sort
I
of
can tell you the
sums up.
story.
It sort of sums up, I guess, the tension between the two sides of the family at this time.
Well, actually, this photo is an attempt to present a united front. So I'll hold up my copy of this.
Sure.
Um, this photo was taken in the very end of 1967, published in 1968 by the Associated Press. And at the time, Disney's trying to present a united front a year after Walt's death. And these two characters are put forth as the future of the company working together. Ron Miller, we talked about, Walt's son-in-law, mentored by Walt. Um, his nephew, Walt's nephew, Roy E. Disney, the son of Roy O. Disney, um, at that time, worked a lot on the Disney live action documentaries, nature documentaries. Um, but for many years after Walt's death, and then after his father's death, Roy O. Disney's death in 1971, Roy feels a little bit out of place at his family's company too. It's his family's company too. He decides to leave day-to-day operations in 1977. He decides he's going to focus on investments through his company Shamrock, also his own documentary he makes about sailing, Pacific High. Um, and so uh, if he stays on the board of Disney, but his direct involvement in the day-to-day operations goes away for a number of years until in 1984, he launches an effort to get rid of Disney management at the time, which was his cousin-in-law, the CEO, Ron Miller. So he resigns from the board. Ironically, he resigns on the day that Splash is released. So the first big hit that Disney's had in a long time. Roy overshadows that in many ways by stepping down from the board, and at a time where Wall Street is pretty ravenous in the 1980s. You think of Gordon Gekko and Wall Street, the movie, and um, Disney all of a sudden finds itself under siege by corporate raiders. Nowadays, we call them activist investors, but back then, their place in the food chain was viewed very differently. Um, and all of a sudden, it looks like the company could be torn apart and sold for parts. And so it creates a series of events that ultimately Ron Miller does his best to try to keep Disney intact in as one company, and is successful in doing so through a series of maneuvers. But at the same time, as each new threat against the company comes forward, eventually the board of directors feels that Ron Miller should resign, and he's is forced to resign in September of 1984. So, back to the book cover, it's almost 20 years before the time period I'm talking about, 15 years. There was a hope that the two of these guys could work together the way that Walt and his brother Roy had worked together. Um, at the end of the day, I would say they were probably like oil and water. Um, Most people I talked to would say that there's at least an executive rivalry. I think they both were guided by the hope that they would be able to carry forward their family's legacy. I think they just had different visions about how to do that.
It was my understanding that in just being in this business and having interviewed Roy E. Disney and attending many Disney events and talking to many Disney people, that the two families never were on the same page until just a few years ago, when the debacle of Bob Chapek raised its ugly head, and Bob Iger, who sort of handed over the company to Chapek, only to take it back away from him, like a year or so later. But the two companies finally get the two families, the Walt side of the family and the Roy side of the family, sort of come together in supporting Bob Iger. To me, it just seemed like this was a long time coming, and it was something that both sides of the family could rally around in order to um, save the company from another round of perhaps corporate raiders that were, waiting in the wings.
So, I mean, Walt and his brother Roy were very close. But as the years went on, as their families grew, my understanding is that they spent less and less time outside of work together. Um, and so there are moments for sure where the entire Disney family comes together, both sides. For example, within 100 days of the Nixon White House, they're all together for the ceremony honoring Walt to raise money for Cal Arts ultimately. And you see, the Disney dynasty in many ways gathered together to honor Walt's legacy. Roy O. Disney in some of the pictures is off to the side, while Walt and Roy E. Disney are in the center with their entire families. But that probably was more of an anomaly um, than day-to-day reality.
Mm-hmm.
They, just over time, outside of whatever was happening at the studio, from my conversations with Walter Miller, who's the son of Ron Miller and the grandson of Walt Disney, they just did not necessarily get to meet their cousin, their second cousins much. The families would support each other when it came to preserving their parents' legacy. Their big projects, both Cal Arts, which is a major part of Walt's legacy, and Roy O. Disney's legacy. Um, Diane Disney and Roy E. Disney were both on the board at the same time. Um, and again, as you're talking about in just the past couple of years, both sides of the family issued statements in support of Bob Iger. There are other cases where Roy E. Disney came in, and this is after the forced resignation, but he came in to support the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, now considered one of the most important buildings built in America in the past century. But when that project was faltering, he came in and helped sort of give an infusion of support for that project. And in turn, Diane in times would support her cousin as well. So, um, it's not a, my understanding is it's not a super close relationship. Um, and I think that again, Roy E. Disney and Ron Miller, uh, after what happened in 1984, it definitely, I think Roy even said it did not make us any closer than we were before when that happened. But when it came to respecting and honoring the legacy of the Disney brothers, I think they both would reach out and support each other because they're, that legacy is very important, even to this day, with something like the Walt Disney Family Museum. So, that it's yeah, there's distance, but there's also a willingness to make sure that the family legacy is preserved.
Well, we have only scratched the surface, and I could go on for another half hour talking with you. This is a great book. And again, I encourage people, whether you're a Disney fan or not, and it's hard to believe that there are people out there that are not Disney fans, right, Neil? There's going to be, there's something in here for everybody. And whether you want to know more about Lloyd Alexander, the Black Cauldron, you want to know more about Disney, it is After Disney. That's the name of the book. Toil, Trouble, and the Transformation of America's Favorite Media Company by Neil O'Brien. And Neil, I want to thank you for your time in talking about your book. And hopefully we can get together and do this again. I thoroughly enjoyed the time, and I am so taken by this book. I love this book. And it sort of fills in that gap, an important time period. And as I said, I'm a big Disney fan, so you're preaching to the choir here. But I thought I know you've done a wonderful job with this book.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you for saying all that. I wanted to write a book that both super fans could enjoy, but also people who don't necessarily feel as strongly about the company can still enter the story through this very human tale of um, loss, of legacy, and of corporate uncertainty. I think there's definitely hopefully things that people can cling on to depending on whatever their level of Disney enthusiasm is. So thank you for having me on today.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us on the Philly Factor. My name's Paul Perrello. We'll catch you the next time around.